When I was a young child, around Bar Mitzvah, I remember when the Rebbe came out with a campaign that every Jewish child should acquire a letter in the Sefer Torah, that every Jewish child should have a letter in the Sefer Torah, and to write Sefer Torah just for children, to unite children all over the world, and that this would bring blessing to all of these children. This would be protection to all of these children. And I and my partner, study partner, went around from door to door around the yeshiva on Ocean Parkway, knocking on every door, every apartment, to talk to the parents to buy a letter for their children. And we had a list. We took down their names and their mother's names, and we wrote down all the children, all the names in the family. And then after that, the Rebbe came out with another mitzvah that every adult should have a letter in the Sefer Torah. And then again, we went from door to door to make sure that every Jew, every family member had a letter in the Sefer Torah. What is the source for this? What is the message behind it? How do we understand this on 5 levels? On the level of Pshat, it says in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, verse number 19. It says over there, God tells the Jewish people, Kisvu lochem es hashira hazois v'lamda es b'nei Yisrael, that you shall write a Torah for yourself. You shall write this song, because Torah is like a song. It needs to be done with joy and happiness. And you shall teach it to the Jewish people. In other words, the objective of every Jew having a Sefer Torah is that you simply have a book where to look inside, to learn, and from that learning to bring into action. As we know, Ma'aseh hu ha'ikar, the most important thing is the deed. This is a mitzvah that is quoted in the Rambam, mitzvah number 18, and similarly the Chinuch enumerates this as mitzvah 613, the final mitzvah in the Torah, implying that after we finish this mitzvah, we are ready to enter into the land of Israel. We are ready to welcome the coming of Mashiach. So this is the Pshat. Now it's interesting to note that to write a Sefer Torah is very expensive. It can cost anywhere from $30,000 to $90,000, and it's a very difficult challenge to be able to put all this money together to write a Sefer Torah. And therefore, the Rebbe explained that by the fact that you have a letter in the Sefer Torah, you really are a partner in the entire Torah. Because if one letter is missing from the Torah, if one letter is not kosher from the Sefer Torah, the entire Sefer Torah is puzzle, is not kosher. And therefore, by simply buying one letter for $1, or for $5, or $18, a children's Sefer Torah is $1. An adult may be a bit more. By purchasing even one letter in the Sefer Torah, you have fulfilled the mitzvah of writing yourself a Torah. So this is the Pshat. Now it's interesting to note that the Rosh, a great codifier, says that nowadays, by purchasing a set of Chumashim, 5 books of Moses, or buying a set of Mishnah, or buying a set of Talmud, you fulfill the mitzvah of writing the Torah, because the purpose and the objective of buying the Torah is to learn from it. Today you don't need to have a Torah scroll. You have a Torah book. You can learn from that same book, and you fulfill the mitzvah of learning. However, most commentaries explain that the Rosh, his official position is not to be learned as a substitute to acquiring a Sefer Torah, but rather as a supplement. In other words, that in addition to having a Sefer Torah, yes, you also need to have the set of Chumashim, you also need to have the set of Mishnah, you also need to have the set of Talmud and Shulchan Aruch and the Tanya and Likutei Sichos and all these other things to enhance your house with holy books, so you shall learn Torah and therefore become a better person. So this is the Pshat, the simple interpretation of the mitzvah. and also of the opportunity and the campaign for every Jew to have a letter in the Sefer Torah. What is the remez, the hint? The question is, Moshe Rabbeinu, before he passed away, wrote 13 Sefer Torah, and he gave each tribe a Sefer Torah. So all the 12 tribes received a Torah, and then one Torah was placed in the Holy of Holies, and there's a discussion whether it was in the actual Ark, which is the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark, or it was on the side of the Ark. But one thing is for sure, that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote a Torah that was placed into the Holy of Holies. Now, the question is, how was it possible for Moshe Rabbeinu to write 13 Sefer Torah in one day? The most simple answer is, it was a miracle. And it happened by itself. The feather, the inkwell, wrote all 13 Sefer Torah magically, miraculously. However, the problem is that a mitzvah is supposed to be done through nature, not miraculously. So even though we could say it was done miraculously, that would not be the best answer. So how do we understand the mitzvah of Sefer Torah being written 13 Sefer Torah? So the remez, the hint to this, is found in the verse in the book of Exodus, in the Pasha of Mishpatim, chapter 24, verse number 7. There it says that Moshe Rabbeinu took the Sefer Habris, he took the Book of Covenant, and Vayikra, he called it out and he read it, Ba'aznei ha'am, in the ears of the Jewish people. And he said to them all that God told him. As Rashi tells us there, that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down from Bereshis, from the beginning of the Torah, up until Matan Torah, up until the giving of the Torah, including the mitzvos that the Jews were commanded in Marah, a few days before the Torah was given on Sinai. And therefore already Moshe Rabbeinu wrote all of that down ahead of time. In other words, throughout the 40 years, as Moshe Rabbeinu taught the Jewish people the Torah, the Jewish people wrote down those sections of the Torah. And therefore, as the Gemara tells us in the tractate of Gittin, page 60, side A, that Torah Megillah Nitna, the Torah was written by pages. Each parchment had 3 or 4 columns, and all of these pages, all of these parchments were put together in a stack. And on the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, he finished the last few columns of the Torah. And then they were sewed up together and put onto a Eitz Chaim, and they put onto a piece of wood, which is the wood of life, the tree of life, and it became one scroll. So this is the remez, the hint of how it was done. It wasn't done in one day. It wasn't done in the last moment of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, but throughout the 40 years of the desert, the Torah was written. Now the question comes to mind, how could that be? They were only commanded to write the Torah at the end of the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, in the portion of Ayelech, on the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's death, or a few days before. So how is it possible to write all of these 13 scrolls in one shot? And the answer is that we find that Jacob, when he came down to Egypt, he brought with him seeds to plant for the acacia wood that would be used later in the Mishkan to build the tabernacle in the desert. Yaakov was commanded by God, you should know, one day there will be a mitzvah to build a Mishkan. Therefore now you are to plant. And similarly, the Jewish people were told ahead of time, you should know, God will give you a Sefer Torah. It's a present, a gift that God will dictate letter by letter to Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore you shall prepare for it. And therefore throughout the 40 years of the desert, they were writing these dafim, they were writing these megillas, they were writing these parchments, and they were stacking them one on top of the other. And finally, the official mitzvah was given. Finally, the official command was told that they should sew it together and make it into one scroll. One can ask, that the mitzvah and the holiness of God's holy, ineffable name only acquired the holiness after the mitzvah, after the command. And therefore, how could they write the name of God without being commanded to do so? And the answer to this is found in a story of the Arizal, the holy Arizal, the Ari HaKadosh, the author of the many, many works of the Kisvei Arizal, the great classical Kabbalist, asked a sofer to write for him a Torah. However, he told him to leave out all the names of God, that he would fill it in later, afterwards, himself, using his deep knowledge and his encyclopedic knowledge of the secrets of Kabbalah, how each name of God should be written, how each letter of God's name should be written, and how each name of God would carry a different attribute depending on the section in which it was written. And so it's possible that the Jewish people wrote most of the Torah scroll throughout the 40 years, and then finally when the command was given, on the final day, then they entered in the name of God in all of those locations from the beginning of the Torah until the end of the Torah. So this is the remez, this is the hint of how the Torahs were written on the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's passing. What is drush, homiletics, or halacha? In a visit from Rabbi Pinchas Menachem Alter, the Rosh Yeshiva of Sfas Emes, and later the great Rebbe of the Gerach Chassidim, Rabbi Pinchas Menachem asked the Rebbe, is it true that the women should also participate in the mitzvah? Because according to many of the codifiers, the mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah is upon men, not women. And yet the Rebbe called for every man and woman to acquire a letter in the Sefer Torah. The Rebbe validated the statement and said, yes, I want every man and every woman to have a letter in the Sefer Torah. And the Rebbe backed this up with the teaching in the Code of Jewish Law that says, in Simin Mem Zayin, chapter number 47, there it says that a woman, before she studies the Torah, is to make the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem, Elikeinu melech haolam, asher bacha banu mikol ha'ami, v'nasan lanu es teirasei, Baruch Atah Hashem neisin ha'Torah. A woman should make the bracha before she studies Torah. Why? Because according to the Shulchan Aruch, a woman has the obligation to learn the mitzvahs of the Torah in order to perform those mitzvahs. And therefore, she needs to learn all the 365 negative commandments and all the positive commandments that pertain to a woman. And because of this, she has a connection to the Torah, because the purpose of having a Torah is to learn the Torah. And therefore, she needs to learn all of these mitzvahs that pertain to her. I heard once that in the name of the Chafetz Chaim, the Chafetz Chaim said that if a man would know all the laws pertaining to a woman that a woman has to keep in the Torah, that man would be a great Torah genius, a great Torah giant, a big Talmud Chacham. So there are many, many laws that women need to learn, and therefore women should acquire a letter in the Sefer Torah. It's a very, very important thing. So this is the drush, the homiletics. And the Rebbe went on to say that this concept of a woman making a bracha on the Torah is not a new concept in the 20th century or the 21st century, but rather this was from the beginning of time, because there is no evidence that this bracha was given later to women at a later time in history. On the contrary, the Shulchan Aruch says simply that it's an obvious thing that a woman who learns Torah makes the bracha, implying that the woman was given the Torah just like a man, and the woman has the obligation to learn all of these mitzvahs, and therefore she should make the bracha on the Torah before she begins to learn. What is the soid? What is the esoteric concept pertaining to this mitzvah? The Megale Amukois, a Kabbalistic work, says that the word Yisrael The word Israel is an acronym for Yesh Shishum Ribui Oisius La Torah. There are 600,000 letters in the Torah, implying that every single Jew has a letter in the Sefer Torah. As we know that at Matan Torah, when God gave us the Ten Commandments at Sinai, and he gave us the entire Torah at that time. In other words, he taught Moshe Rabbeinu on 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain all the laws of the Torah, all 613 commandments for all generations. So at that time, every single soul, every single Jew was there at Sinai. All the souls that were there then, and even the souls of the future generations, were there at Sinai, including the neshamas, the souls of the gedim, of the righteous converts of all generations, were all present at Sinai. And there were 600,000 general souls. And from those general souls, there are millions of particular souls. So, Shishim Ribui, 600,000 imply every single general soul. And therefore, every soul has a letter in the Sefer Torah. And that is the meaning of Yisrael. That is what Kabbalah says. Now, there's a famous question that in truth, there are only 304,805 letters in the Torah. So if that is the case, how can we say that the word Yisrael means there are 600,000 letters in the Torah, when in reality, when you count the letters, there are 304,805 letters in the Torah? And the Rebbe explained this numerous times, that we include also the nekudot, the vowels of the Torah. In other words, these vowels are added to the letters, even though we don't write the vowels in the Torah, because a letter with vowels would invalidate the Torah. At the same time, without the vowels, you could not read the words of the Torah. And many of these vowels are also additional letters, like the Yud and the Vav and the Hey and the Aleph, etc., which would include additional letters in the Torah. So if you count the letters of the Torah together with the vowels, then Yesh Shishum Ribui Oisius La Torah, you have actually 600,000 letters in the Torah. This is Kabbalah, this is the Soid, the esoteric level of the Mitzvah. What does Chassidus say? Chassidus says that the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah is not only to know what to do, not only to be able to perform the mitzvahs, but rather it represents the idea of Achdus Yisrael, uniting all the Jewish people together. How do we see this? First and foremost, the law is that every single letter in the Torah, on one hand, needs to be an individual letter. In other words, letters cannot be touching. If letters are touching, it's not kosher. A letter has to have mukav gevil. In other words, it has to have white space around it, and it has to be totally independent one from the other. On the other hand, for a Torah to be kosher, you have to have 304,805 letters in the Torah. And not only that, you have to sew up every parchment, every Megillah of the Torah to make it into one book. If it's separate, it's not kosher. What does this imply? It implies a beautiful theme, a beautiful concept in Yiddishkeit. On one hand, each person is unique. Each person has to contribute their talents to Yiddishkeit, to Torah, to perfecting the world. On the other hand, we are united as one. If we are independent and we do things on our own without uniting all the Jewish people together, it's also not kosher. But the unity of Jews loving each other and caring about each other and doing for each other and working together is not a contradiction to a person's uniqueness and independence. It doesn't crush and squash your talents and your contributions. On the contrary, we need both, and only through these two angles do we create a kosher Sefer Torah. Perhaps we can say that the letters of the Sefer Torah represent each individual person, and the Megillah, which is the parchment that has on it numerous columns and many, many letters represent the Gedolei Yisrael, the leaders of the Jewish people. Yet, the leaders, together with all of the Chassidim and disciples, must be united as one and rolled onto a Eitz Chaim, onto a piece of wood, to make it a kosher, holy Torah. And therefore we need each other, we have to work together with each other. There's a letter from the Rebbe that a Jew is Tzavos Hashem, every one of us is in the army of God. And when it comes to an army of God, we have to follow the laws of the army. On one hand, each soldier is integral. Each soldier has to shoot. Each soldier has to be part of the army. And the soldier has to follow the command, and the commanding officer, and the general, and the commander-in-chief. And that is the meaning in the Torah, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do first, and then we will listen, then we will understand. So the first thing of every letter, the first thing for every Jew is to accept Torah unconditionally. That's a soldier. The next thing is, you have to think about the entire army. You can't go off and do your own thing, because you could bring the entire army into danger. By saying, well, I'll do my thing, they'll do their thing. Once you do that, once you become totally independent, you can put the entire army into terrible, terrible danger. And so that is the idea of achdus, working together. And therefore, we have to realize that our small act, our small deed, could affect the entire army in a positive way, and God forbid, in a negative way. So the idea of writing a Sefer Torah represents the unity of Achdus Yisrael, to join and bring all Jews together. And this is the way we receive God's blessing. We say, Barucheinu Avinu kulanu ke'echad. God bless us, all as one. Our rabbis tell us, kulanu ke'echad, because we are one, then Barucheinu Avinu, we are deserving of God's blessings. A vessel that is complete can receive all of the nourishment, can receive the water, can hold the blessing. If there are holes in the vessel, if the vessel is cracked, it cannot receive the blessing. And so it's interesting to note that after you write all the letters, and after you join them all together by sewing all the parchments, you have to put it onto the Eitz Chaim, onto the tree of life. I once heard that the word Chaim means life. How do you spell Chaim? With two Yuds. Ches, Yud, Yud, Mem. Yud is a Yid. Yud is a Yid. When two Yidden, when two Jews get together, then you have Cham, you have heat, you have life. Someone who is alive is warm. A dead person is cold. To be alive, to receive God's blessings, one Yid has to be connected to another Yid. And that is the idea of taking all of these parchments and putting it onto and placing it upon the Eitz HaChaim. Furthermore, the Rebbe explains, when you tell a person that you now have a letter in the Sefer Torah, you bought a letter in the Sefer Torah, a letter in the Sefer Torah is being written for you, that individual now feels an integral part of the Jewish people. That person feels that it's connected to God, because this letter was dictated by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. And as the Zohar says, Eiraisa v'kutshabrichu v'Yisrael kulachad, that the Torah and God and the Jewish people are truly one. So becoming one with the Torah, I am now becoming one with God. And therefore this gives me strength to be able to fulfill the Torah. This gives me strength to be able to fulfill my mission in the world. It validates me. I am written in the Torah. And that is why the Rebbe quoted a verse from Daniel. That Daniel says that anyone who is written in this book will be protected. What is this book? This alludes to the Sefer Torah. Anyone that is written in this book is now protected and given tremendous strength to fulfill the Torah and perform the mitzvahs, and to have tremendous success in everything that you do, in all your business and in all your undertakings, to have amazing blessings from Almighty God. And therefore, by having a letter in the Sefer Torah, we are reminded that God dictated this letter to Moshe. We are reminded that God dictated this letter and God had you in mind. So when we open the Torah, we read Bereshis, the first word. Beis stands for bracha. Beis stands for Batya. Reish stands for Ruvain. Aleph stands for Aaron. Taf stands for Tamara. We're all there. Every one of us was written in the Torah. Every letter is connected to every single person. And therefore, this gives us additional inspiration. This gives us additional blessing to be able to fulfill our mission in this world. And so, in conclusion, by writing a letter in the Sefer Torah, by having a letter in the Sefer Torah, number one, we are finishing the final mitzvah of the Torah. After Moshe Rabbeinu was given the final mitzvah, the Jewish people entered into the land of Israel. And therefore we too will enter into the land of Israel with the coming of Mashiach. Number two, the Sefer Torah protects us from harm, from epidemics. As many of you know that numerous Torahs were written recently because of the terrible COVID-19 epidemic. A story was told that the Baal Shem Tov was once approached by a person, and he asked the Baal Shem Tov, what should we do? There's a terrible pandemic that broke out. Please pray for us. The Baal Shem Tov closed his eyes and he entered into the higher chambers. And he came back down and said, I am sorry. There's nothing that I can do. Rebbe, please, you must do something. The Baal Shem Tov said, yes, I saw that there is one thing that can save you from this terrible pandemic. And that is if you write a Sefer Torah and you include all the people of the community in this Torah, then you will be spared from this pandemic. And so today, with this terrible epidemic, it's very, very crucial that each one of us acquire a letter in the Sefer Torah. To look up on the web, there are numerous Sefer Torahs for COVID-19, Unity Torahs, and by doing so, this will give us the blessings of protection. Furthermore, you could look up kidstorah.org to acquire a letter for a child under bar or bat mitzvah, for a girl or a boy, to make sure they have a Torah. There was a young couple that went to the Rebbe shortly after giving birth to a child. The child had numerous complications. The doctors were very concerned. And so they came to the Rebbe, what should we do? And the Rebbe said, does your daughter have a letter in the Sefer Torah? Does the child have a letter in the children's Sefer Torah? Implying by having a letter in the children's Sefer Torah, this will bring protection and blessing and healing to the child. And so, my dear friends, this is a simple mitzvah, an easy mitzvah to do, yet a powerful mitzvah that carries tremendous blessing and tremendous weight. And so we hope and pray that all of us will fulfill this mitzvah, not only on all levels of Pshat, Remesh, Drus, Tzor, and Chassidus, but most practically to simply acquire a letter in the Sefer Torah, and we will truly be spared, we will truly be saved, we will truly be blessed with Almighty God's blessings. And the ultimate blessing, the final mitzvah of the Torah. And together we will go together with all the Jewish people throughout the entire world, the Kabel Pnei Mashiach Sitkenu, to receive the countenance of Mashiach in Jerusalem speedily in our days.